Hey everyone, Brady from Texturelabs.org here with a Photoshop tutorial. Kind of a wild card here. We're going to be creating this pixelated 3D blockhead, an effect largely inspired by the movie The Mandela Effect. I should say the movie trailer because I haven't actually seen the movie, but it reminded me of these incredible sculptures by an artist named Han Hsu-Tung. I'd love to own one of these sculptures one day, but luckily for now we have Photoshop. So we're going to be doing a little bit of work in the 3D workspace, which I know can be a little bit confusing, but I'll try to keep it nice and clear. Let's jump into Photoshop and check it out. Alright, well I've got a portrait here ready to apply this effect to. This is a fairly high resolution image. This is about 2600 by 3600 pixels or so. The first thing I'm going to do is hit L for the lasso tool, and I'm going to make sure I have the polygonal lasso tool selected, the one with the sharp corners, not the loopy one. And before I start making a selection, I'm going to turn off the anti-aliasing checkbox. I want this to be a really chunky pixelated selection. So I'm going to start to click around the edges of the face here, and I'm holding the Shift key while I do that. Shift is going to constrain the selection to just horizontal and vertical lines and get this really blocky selection. What I'm doing is selecting as much of the face as I can, but making sure I never go off the edges. I don't want any of the hairline, I don't want any of the background. I just want that crazy extrusion effect to be limited to the face. So something like that. Alright, then I'm going to use the shortcut Command-J or Control-J on a PC to duplicate that selection to a new layer. By itself, that layer looks like this. Alright, next I'm going to go up into the Window menu and open the 3D panel. I already have the Properties panel open. I'm going to lump these two panels together because they kind of work in tandem with each other. In the 3D panel, I'm going to select this Mesh from Depth Map option. In the dropdown, I'll set it to Plane and hit Create. Alright, well that got us started in the 3D workspace and automatically switched me to the Move tool. So I can click and drag to rotate around this strange object. What is this thing? Well, what Mesh from Depth Map did was to create a flat plane that has been displaced on the Z-axis, or kind of forward and backward in space, based on the brightness of the image. So here on the bright spots of the nose, you get these areas that are pushed forwards out in space, and then maybe the darkest parts of the eyebrows got pushed back in space. So this might start to give you a very general sense of how this effect will work. While we're still in move mode here, I'm just going to get the camera position a little bit more lined up so the face is in the right place. I'm clicking and dragging to rotate around the scene here, but I can also get a little more specific by selecting this item called Current View in the 3D panel. That gives me the properties of the camera, and I'm going to change the FOV, or field of view, to be a 90mm lens, more of a zoom lens that frames things up a little better. This portrait was probably shot on a longer lens anyway, so it'll make the perspective match a little better. Then I'll just drag and rotate the camera and get that at least in the right ballpark. Alright, then in the 3D panel, I'm going to select this thing called Depth Map. This is the actual 3D object itself, and in the Properties tab, I'll click where it says Edit Source. And that opens up another document. When you create a 3D object in Photoshop, it automatically creates kind of a smart object, and any changes I make to this file will actually change the 3D object in the scene. So check out what happens if I do something simple, like put another layer in here and paint a bunch of black right through the middle of it. I'll save this document to update it and switch back over. First of all, there's a little bug here. Sometimes when you update one of the source files, it kind of changes the position of the object and sends it all the way up here. What I can do is go into the Properties tab, and in the second little section here, this is the Coordinates section, I'll click on Reset Coordinates. That'll move this object back to the center of the scene. Then maybe I can drag it back up a little bit into place. Usually once you get that back in place, it doesn't happen again. But what we're looking at here is that the change I made to that source file, the black areas I painted in, are now getting pushed further back into space. And what's nice is that it didn't affect the color. The color actually has its own source file. So that means I can really experiment with this depth file and customize what kind of shape this creates. So let's go back to that source file. I'm going to delete the black paint layer and create a totally different depth map here. So first thing I'll do is create a new layer. I'm going to hit M for the marquee tool and drag out just a tiny little rectangle. You can see in the overlay this is like 20 by 30 pixels. Then I'm going to use Edit, Fill, and I'll set this to fill with 50% gray. Next, with this little shape still selected, I'm going to go into the Filter menu and in the Noise section use Add Noise. I'll set this to 50% Uniform Monochromatic Noise. So those settings, by the way, give me the most even distribution of black and white and gray pixels. Then I'm going to change the opacity of this layer to about 50%. That's just temporary so I can see through it for a moment. I'm going to use Command T or Control T to transform and scale this way, way, way up. So you can see why it was important to make such a small rectangle. In this case, I'm scaling this up to about 9,000% to get these really large blocks. I'm kind of eyeballing how large to make this. You can probably kind of imagine how this will create those big pixelated shapes. Before I commit to this transform, there's an important thing here though. I need to change the interpolation style up here to nearest neighbor. That'll keep this nice and blocky and pixelated when I hit return to commit to that transformation. All right, let me bring the opacity of this back up to 100%. I'm also going to create a clipping mask by holding the Option key on a Mac or the Alt key on a PC and clicking in between the two layers. So now we can really get a sense of this block face shape. I might even move this layer on top around a little bit and try to get rid of any of the tiny slices on the edges. I want this to be made up of just nice big blocks of geometry. All right, I'm going to hit save here and go back and take a look at what it's doing. So turning into a blockhead here, there are a few tweaks I have to make, and it's mostly regarding the edges. So while the middle looks cool, I need all the blocks on the edges to be completed. I don't know if you can tell, but the blocks on the edges get cut off and kind of have holes on the outside of them. I can fix that by going back to this source file, and on this base layer, the one at the bottom, I'm going to go into the effects menu and apply a stroke effect. If I reset that to default, then change the position to outside and bring it up to maybe 5 pixels, that gives me this black outline around the whole thing. If I save that and switch back, that black outline now means all of these shapes will terminate by going all the way back to the furthest point. There's one missing piece here. The color of this object is coming from yet another file, and it's actually going transparent on the edges. Follow me for a second and this will make sense. I'm going to select the background layer again, the entire image, then use Select All and Command or Control C to copy that to the clipboard. Then I'm going to select the 3D layer again, and in the 3D panel, I'm going to select this item that's kind of in the drop down under the depth map object. This is the material assigned to this object. So in the properties window, you can see it has all these different values for the material. Kind of a side note here, one thing I don't want is for this material to be reflective at all. So I'm going to bring this metallic value to 0. But the main thing I'm here to do is in the little folder icon next to base color. If I click on that little folder and select Edit Texture, I do get a little warning here, that's okay. But this takes me to yet another source file. So this is the color of the 3D object, which is still the face that I originally clipped out. What I'm going to do here is just use Command or Control V to paste in that entire image I just copied. Then I can save that and return to the main document. Now all of that transparency that I was getting on the edges is gone. All right, I'm going to go ahead and line this up a little bit better. I prefer not to rotate the 3D object, but instead select the camera and drag that around to line things up a little better. That way I'm not rotating the object relative to the lighting or anything. That being said, I might actually select the object and scale it up or down a little bit, maybe even move it a little bit. And if I can find the Scale on Z axis handle, it's a little tricky to find that. I can even scale it out in one direction. It's kind of cool when that starts to get sort of extreme on the Z axis. All right, and at the bottom of both the 3D panel and the properties panel, there's a little render button that I can hit to give that a quick test render. At any point you can hit escape and stop the render, but that is starting to look pretty good. There are some big black holes in here, which is telling me that some of the values on that depth map are just too dark and they're getting pushed way back into 3D space. So I can adjust that by going back into the source file and creating a levels adjustment layer. I'm also going to Option or Alt click, so that's part of the clipping mask. And here I can lift up the black output level just to maybe 45 or 50. So none of these values ever get completely black. All right, let me save that and go back and take a look at the 3D model. And maybe some of these blocks are not lining up in a way that looks quite right. What's nice is I can go back to the source file and move that blocky texture around. Then every time I save that, I can come back to the main document and just see what kind of shapes it created. So I might end up going back and forth 2 or 3 times, just experimenting until I find some shapes that are looking cool. I'll try to keep things moving along here, but it's probably worth spending 5 minutes or so just trying to find the most interesting placement of that depth map. All right, well, let's give it another quick test render. And the lighting is actually by coincidence kind of coming down in the same direction as the photo. I can always select this infinite light in the 3D panel and drag that around to change the angle a little bit if I want, maybe make the shadows a little bit less of a harsh angle. And while I have the light selected, I'm going to bring the shadow softness up from 0 all the way to 100. I think that'll make it look a little bit more natural. I'll give it another quick test render and actually let it go a little bit further this time. And let's take a look at one more thing here. I'm getting some little artifacts in the shading, and the corners aren't quite looking like sharp edges. So there's a simple thing I can do that'll clean this up quite a bit, but before the next step, I'm gonna save this document because at least on my machine, this next step does crash Photoshop about 50% of the time. All right, with that saved, I'm gonna select the depth map object, and in the 3D menu up top, I'm gonna use Simplify Mesh. All right, well, it might be a little hard to see what's going on here. I'm gonna make the mesh overlay white instead of black. So this object is actually made up of about 70,000 distinct faces. And if I bring the simplify value way down, so this thing is maybe 1/10 of that value, it's gonna make these shapes more like big flat pieces of geometry, which is more what I'm going for here. All right, unfortunately, when I hit OK on that, it did that same bug and reset all the coordinates of that object. So I'm just gonna find that and get it all back into place here. And I'm also gonna refine the camera angle just a little bit further here. I can switch between the tools here to either rotate or zoom in a little bit. Now this doesn't have to be perfect, but I actually want this 3D object to be a bit larger than the face, and that'll give me some extra room to mask out the edges. All right, I'm gonna use the marquee tool and just drag a selection around the areas I want rendered here. That'll speed it up a little bit when I hit the button for a final render. All right, let's jump forward in time a little bit and let that finish. And even though that's a final render, this is still a live 3D layer. Anything I do here will lose that render. So I can either right click and select rasterize 3D, or a nice little trick I found is that if you have any active selection with the marquee tool, I can just use Command or Control J to make a duplicate of that selection, and that'll actually make a new layer with a flattened duplicate on it. So I can turn off the live 3D layer, and I'll keep that just in case I want to come back and adjust it. But I think this render is a pretty good jumping off point. Now all it's going to take is just a little bit of compositing to blend this into the image. And the only place in this render that looks like I might run into a little trouble is down here where the shapes are not quite long enough to cover the face. I'm going to use the clone tool and just kind of clone a little bit of that area to kind of cheat it and fill in the blanks here. I'm also going to do a little bit of color adjustment on this 3D render, first by creating a levels adjustment layer, which I can use to bring up the midtones a little bit, and I want to be sure to create a clipping mask so it only affects this layer. I'm also going to add a hue saturation adjustment, and I think just add a touch of saturation. Then I'll create a regular layer mask for the layer and use the brush tool with the color set to black and just kind of a soft brush and start to roughly mask out the edges here. Then I'm going to unlink the layer in the layer mask so I can transform this layer. I'm just going to rotate it a little bit and line it up with the forehead and the chin. Then I can start to get a little more detailed with the layer mask by zooming in, using a smaller brush, and I'm sure you guys won't mind if I kind of time ramp through this, just painting in the edges of the mask here. All right, one more levels adjustment layer. I'm going to drag down the white output level to give me some more shadowy values. I'll include that in the clipping mask, then invert the mask on this layer so I can use the brush tool and just paint any areas where I want the levels adjustment to give me some darker values. Maybe I can make the levels just a little bit more subtle here. Then you know how it goes. I can always come back to that layer mask and just refine it a little bit more. I'm not going to get too crazy with it here, but let's see if we can glue the whole thing together by making a merged copy of the entire image. If I select the top layer and use that unfortunate shortcut, which I will put up on the screen, then I'm going to use Camera Raw Filter to make some final overall adjustments here. And I can just experiment here with the general values as though this had come right off my digital camera. I like to add some sharpening to an image and also add some grain. Most digital cameras are going to give you an image that has a little bit of grain and a little bit of sharpening already in there. And of course, you could just keep experimenting and refining things from here, but let's call that a finished image. All right, well, I hope you guys have enjoyed this tutorial. If so, please do hit that like button and be sure to check out the Texturelabs channel for more cool stuff. Thank you to the Texturelabs.org Patreon supporters, and thank you for watching. I will see you next time.